The deployment itself is the problem. We have very specific guardrails in the United States to make sure that we live under a civilian authority, not military rule. And so if the president wants to deploy the military, if the president wants to deploy the National Guard without the consent of state and local leaders, there are only extremely specific, rare circumstances under which he can do that. That's invasion. There's no invasion. That's rebellion. There's no rebellion. And if the state and local authorities are unwilling or unable to execute the laws. And we have not seen that the case. The LAPD, state and local authorities, they believe that they were perfectly capable of dealing with the mostly peaceful protests. Yes, there were some instances of violence and destruction, which are abhorrent, but the vast majority of people were exercising their constitutional right to protest. And the deployment of the military and the National Guard is unlawful without any invocation of the Insurrection Act. The president did not have the authority to do what he did, and it wasn't needed on the ground, according to the state and local leaders whose views matter in these circumstances.
Well, I'm glad you raised the Insurrection Act, Elizabeth, because the president was asked directly about that in the Oval Office earlier today, knowing that the military personnel currently deployed do face limitations on the conduct with which they can engage. They can't act in a law enforcement capacity. The Insurrection Act, though, if the president decided to take that step, would give them that power. How should we consider what qualifications need to be met for President Trump to actually declare that an insurrection is underway?
Well, I think there might be close cases of that. I think this one is not one of those close cases. You have people who are protesting immigration raids that they find outrageous, that they find to be an intrusion on their community. Instead of focusing on violent criminal people who are here without authorization, they're rounding up our neighbors and community members who are just trying to work and support their families. So the people are rightfully expressing their outrage and mostly peacefully protesting. So this is not one of those close cases where you're like, is this an insurrection or is it not? And I think the really disturbing message that we're getting here from the deployment of the National Guard and the military is that it does seem as if President Trump is using the military in unprecedented and frankly unlawful ways to further his political agenda. We certainly saw on January 6th, which I think you could make a very good case that there was an insurrection there with the attack on the Capitol. There was a request for National Guard support, and President Trump did not provide that, arguably because it didn't support his agenda. But here, where you see the deployment when people are protesting actions that his administration is taking, that is very disturbing because in America, we don't do that. The military is not supposed to be politicized. It's not supposed to be weaponized to use to pursue a particular agenda or not. Whatever political party you belong to, we should all as Americans be able to agree on that.
Elizabeth, we're hearing from immigrant advocacy groups about some of the folks who have been detained and arrested that led to the protests. We haven't spent much time talking about any of their cases because we don't know that much about them. But apparently many were detained even though they did not have a criminal record. And one particular case came to light in the Washington Post, that of Juan Fernando, who was pulled out of a clothing company where he was working in Los Angeles and was deported so quickly. His parents say they did not have time to get an attorney. It's a pretty remarkable story. He, in fact, thought he had signed a consent to a coronavirus test, but may have inadvertently signed off on his own deportation, was told to cross an international bridge back to Mexico, and was not allowed back. Is this legal?
It definitely doesn't sound legal or in accordance with due process to me, without knowing more of the facts, of course. But that's part of the problem. And that is what people are protesting. As a Southern Californian myself, our communities are full of people who are hardworking immigrants, some who are unauthorized, who don't have papers, but they are hardworking members of our community. And I think that's why you're seeing the protests in the streets in Los Angeles, because these raids happen in the garment district, like the case you just mentioned, to workers who are gathering outside Home Depot to try to engage in labor to support their families. And that's why you're seeing people come out in the streets, because this is not what they want their government to be doing, to be targeting these members of our communities.
Well, and when we consider that that is an effort that has been underway and a primary goal of this administration, Elizabeth, we know that they have run into some difficulty in the courts, including a Supreme Court, which has ruled that due process needs to be afforded to many of these individuals. Have you seen direct evidence to this point of the Trump administration directly flouting the courts when it comes to immigration-related directives?
So we have seen that the actions in court are working to put up the guardrails that the Constitution and the law puts forth. I want to be totally clear that people understand due process applies to every person in this country. There are some rights under the Constitution that apply to citizens. Due process expressly applies to everyone in this country, citizen or not. So it's incredibly important for our constitutional democracy to work to ensure that everyone, including people who are immigrants here, including people who are undocumented immigrants here, get the due process that the Constitution requires. It's part of the foundation of the United States. It's guaranteed in the Constitution, and the courts are ensuring that that happens. And we can only hope that the Trump administration continues to follow court orders and that these guardrails continue to hold. But the people who are going out and saying, this is not what we voted for, are making an important point. They're raising their voices as the Constitution allows them and protects their right to do so.